All right, now I can share your screen. I think. I have both of them. Now, where did they go? They are here. And hang on. Okay.
We have to close it and like redo it. It should open the new. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Perfect. All right, let us know if you
Sorry.
need anything. No problem.
Now let's see. Is that good? And here is your clicker. And if people have questions, I will bring the microphone around. We're only 1 minute late.
Is there a microphone up there?
There's a microphone up there, and it's for the online people. You have to speak into the for the online people to hear.
This is the clicker.
That's the clicker, and I can testify that it works.
All right, I'm gonna get us started here. So today I'm going to be talking about how faculty across disciplines define the concept of risk-taking in writing. I'm Megan Hancock, and I'm coming from Marshall University in West Virginia. So today's data is from a qualitative research study that I've been gathering data for over a couple years now. So I started it from the fall semester of 2019 and kept doing it until spring semester of 2021. It is from a larger study, which is called Exploring Faculty Perceptions of Risk-Taking in Writing. And my research questions are, how do higher ed faculty define risk-taking when it comes to the writing of their students and their own writing? And do they assess it in their students' writing? And if so, how do they do that? So those were the questions that I was working with. In order to gather that data, I had a survey that I sent out on the WPA listserv when it was still alive, and then also through the two institutions that I was working at, I sent it through listservs of people who are teaching writing intensive courses. So I got 100 complete responses total, and then I got 31 kind of incomplete responses. And then I had some follow-up interviews with 39 of those folks who were willing to talk with me. Before I get into the data itself, I want to talk a little bit about how this came to be and how I got interested in this question. So when I was a lecturer, back when I was kind of a brand new teacher, I was using a rubric that was designed for me to tell students kind of a description of what A grades would look like, B grades would look like, et cetera, for their essays. And I noticed that part of the A grade criteria included successfully taking risks that show initiative and growing independence. So that was something that I was using, but I never talked about that in my classroom. We didn't really, we didn't talk about taking risks. We didn't talk about what that meant, right? So I thought that was kind of interesting when I saw that. And then also just kind of anecdotally, in my conversations with faculty peers, this would come up a lot, particularly when they were talking about student essays that were in the A range, right? So ones that kind of have an X factor, you just know it when you see it sort of thing. I noticed that they were talking about how they love it when students take risks with an essay. That was a really risky approach and it paid off for them, kind of that sort of language. But again, I wasn't sure, and I don't know if they are totally sure what that meant and what that really looked like, or if they could explain what that was, right? So that was part of the reason why I got into it as well. And then finally, I started working for a Writing Enriched Curriculum initiative at Colby College. That's the model that Pamela Flash came up with at the University of Minnesota, where you embed writing instruction throughout a department's major courses. And so in order to do that, you work with departmental faculty to come up with the abilities they want their students to graduate with by the time they leave, and then what criteria the faculty want to use in order to assess it, right? And so I started thinking about, if risk-taking is a writing ability that we want our students to embrace, How do we define it? And what criteria do we look for when we're assessing it or grading it, right? So I will say first, I don't necessarily have a stance on this question. I more or less just wanted to objectively gather what faculty thought about these questions and what they thought it meant, basically. So in terms of my study methods to figure this out, I ended up doing a 9-question survey that I sent to higher ed faculty across disciplines who do any kind of writing instruction in their classes. So that could be anything from lab reports to research papers, whatever you want to talk about. And then I ended up having 30 to 45-minute phone and Zoom follow-up interviews with respondents who were willing to do that with me. In those interviews, we expanded on some of their answers that they had in the survey, and then also in answering one additional question about how they define risk-taking in their disciplines of study as well. So that was how I gathered my data. These were the questions in the survey that I sent out. So I had 9 of them. I'm going to be talking about 3 through 7 today. So the first question was just in general, when you hear the phrase taking risks in writing, what does that mean to you? In the kinds of writing that you do as an academic or as a professional, what would you say it means to take risks in your own writing? Have you ever expected students to take risks in their work for a particular assignment in your classes? If so, would you be willing to share that with me? And then, let's see, have you ever included any kind of risk-taking as a grading criterion in your assessment materials that you share with students? Yeah, it is kind of. Okay. Have you ever included any kind of risk-taking as a grading criterion in assessment materials? So things like assignment guidelines or rubrics that they use, anything like that in writing. So those were the questions that I sent out. In terms of coding methodology, when I was looking through this data, I've used a combination of in vivo and descriptive coding, which may sound like gibberish to people who have never done that before. But if you haven't, it's basically a kind of coding. In vivo is just using language that people have used in the data that you're looking through, right? So if a participant said something kind of interesting and I wanted to use that as a code, that would become a code. And then descriptive coding is basically exactly how it sounds. I come up with my own code based on some of the patterns that I'm noticing, right? So I use a combination of those two things to come up with some major categories that I was noticing in the trends in the data. Okay, and just in case you're curious, this is a pie chart breakdown of where my people were coming from. As you can see, and this is not surprising, the majority of them are from our field in writing studies. That's usually just because they're the ones who are willing to do this kind of thing and they see the value in this type of research. But I did get some people from other disciplines. Those are those little kind of slices that you see there. So I got some psychology folks, I got some history people, public health, media studies, art history, a couple ecology people. So they're in there, it's just not as many as I would perhaps like. Okay, so starting with the results for the first question, which was just that general question of what do you think this means, right? When you hear this word or this phrase, what does that mean to you? I got 116 total responses to that question, and I had 262 references to that question that I was coding. A disclaimer for these next slides. This is not all of the data because that would take me way, way longer to talk about. So I'm just going to give you the biggest trends that I noticed in the data. And these were the biggest trends. So when people thought of that phrase, taking risks in writing, the biggest trend that I noticed was the concept of doing something that goes against the grain in some way. Okay, that was about 65 references or 25% of the total. And this was stuff like anything unconventional, bending genre rules and conventions, going outside of a prompt, any controversial topics or viewpoints, breaking the rules in some way, any non-traditional choices, or anything that's considered out of the box. The second largest trend was 56 references or 21% to any kind of writer-based novelty. So that's something that people are trying for the first time. It's unique to them, to the particular writer, And this has to do with experimenting with new styles, maybe a new genre or strategy, new ways of thinking, topics that are unfamiliar to people, trying new techniques, or maybe trying out some unfamiliar rhetorical spaces. So that was the second biggest trend that I noticed for that question. The third biggest trend was 19 references referring to having a sense of grit in the face of potential failure. So trying something out, even though you know it might not work out, right? So having that kind of uncertainty, basically. The fourth trend was 16 references referring to personal disclosures in writing. So that's talking about trauma, talking about your personal life, being really honest and open with your audience. And that was tied with 16 references to anything outside of the writer's comfort zone. So that's references to anything that makes you feel uncomfortable, things like that. So that was for that general question of just, what does this remind you of? For question 4, when I asked particularly about writers' conceptions of taking risks in their own writing practices, so that could be anything from publishing to writing emails to the kinds of writing that you do in the classroom. I had 114 total responses to that question, and I had 214 references that I was coding. These were actually very similar to the first question. So the first and second categories were essentially the same, going against the grain and writer-based novelty. The only difference was the third largest category was that people were referring to some kind of sharing or broadcasting of their writing. So this had to do with something like writing for the public, any kind of publication or circulation of their writing, knowing that you have a real audience, that kind of thing. So that was new in comparison to the previous question. And then the fourth category was the same, personal disclosures in writing. That was about 18 references or 8%. But it was not tied like the previous one with discomfort. So okay. Question 5 had to do with whether or not people expect their students to take risks in their work for a particular writing assignment. 19 people were unsure. 86 people said, yes, I do expect this of my students. 8 people said no. Of those people who said, yes, I expect that, I asked afterward, if you do expect it, do you include anything in writing that tells your students how to do that well, right? So risk-taking as a grading criterion in assignment materials. So I'm like, okay, if you expect that, do you explain it in writing, basically? And so for 86 respondents, for people who answered yes to the previous question, 40 people said no. I don't really include that in any writing assessment materials that I share with my students. 25 said yes, 17 were not quite sure, and 4 people didn't answer, okay? So almost half said that they don't include risk-taking in their grading criteria, even if they expect their students to do that to get an A on an essay, right? Okay. So in terms of takeaways, after talking about all this data, and I'm very early in the coding process, so some of us seem to encourage that maybe of our students, but we don't necessarily transparently describe that in the criteria that we're giving them. I think it's interesting that a lot of respondents expect that of students, but they're not necessarily being transparent in the grading criteria about it, which was definitely something that I was doing as a teacher, right? Some questions to keep thinking about. What does risk-taking in writing look like in your classroom? Do you happen to talk about it with your students or not? Do you hope that they do it, but maybe don't explicitly state that with them? Do you know it when you see it, or do you have a more specific set of features or moods that you look for that you're maybe not talking about with them? And another question that I'm also still thinking about is how faculty might define risk-taking in the writing of their students in particular. What does that look like? What does that sound like? I thought it was particularly interesting that 33% of respondents to that very first question referred to either students or student writing. So when they were thinking about that general question of what does risk-taking in writing mean, they mentioned students or student writing. So they are thinking about it when they're getting that question. 23% of those responses had to do with doing something novel, right? So expecting students to try something new. 22 were against the grain definition. So expecting students to try something kind of different, either with a genre or with an assignment, right? So that's kind of interesting. It doesn't necessarily imply what they mean by student writing and how it has to do with risk taking, but I thought that was kind of an interesting trend. So pretty much all I have for today. Those are some questions.
If you want to stop sharing.
It's freezing, yeah.
They went too far in the other direction.
Sometimes those things just work. Oh, that's the same.
Very small.
Okay.
No, probably not.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for those on Zoom and in person who've joined us. I am Grace Gillenworth. I'm an associate professor at Rowan University.
I'm Emily Nolan. I'm a graduate student in Rowan's MA in Writing program.
And we're so excited to share with you today some findings from a research project we've been working on the last couple of years. Just to note, we do have a QR code here. We have just two handouts, which you may be interested in looking at, a summary of our codes and some samples from our data. And an assignment sheet that we'll talk about that at the end, as well as a script of the presentation today, in case anybody would like to access that for accessibility purposes. And we also would like to same thing, offer special thanks to the Rowan Center for Innovation. There we go. Rowan Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship for their generous funding. So our outline for today, pretty standard. Give you a little bit of background on the project. We're going to talk a little bit about our methods, our findings, and some takeaways. Yes, and my daughter is attending the academic presentation.
She's gonna remember too.
Some background of this project. This project sprung from my experiences with teaching sophomore engineering clinic at Rowan. And to give you a little background, this is a team talk course between our writing department and our engineering department. And it's basically a specialized version of a Comp 2, so like a research-based composition, first-year composition class. One of the focuses for our engineering program is entrepreneurship. And so we've been working to integrate entrepreneurial mindset into our engineering curriculum. And just a little bit more layered background here. Rowan is partnered with Keen, which is a group that promotes this idea of entrepreneurial mindset, and there are kind of 3 C's that they focus on are curiosity, connections, and creating value. So one of the ways that this manifests in our curriculum is through this Shark Tank style pitch that's part of the class. So students in this class, they conduct lab projects and write lab reports. And then we focus in the writing section on information literacy, research, and creating deliverables for public audiences. So they'll do things like annotated bibliographies and literature reviews, and then this final project, they'll design a hypothetical solution to a problem and then pitch it Shark Tank style to a pretend audience of stakeholders or me. So that's the scenario for that. So in reflecting on the course, and especially the final pitch presentation, we began to wonder about entrepreneurial communication and what other types of writing might be valuable to students in their learning and communication in engineering. Particularly, we were concerned that students might not be getting an accurate picture of the day-to-day work of typical modes and styles of communication for engineers, and particularly engineering entrepreneurs. So about the same time as our group of instructors was reconsidering our curriculum, we had the opportunity to conduct research on Luminaire, which is a startup company founded in 2020, so mid-pandemic, by a mechanical engineer with extensive experience in the HVAC industry. Their mission is to improve indoor air quality and combat the spread of pathogens in buildings and mass transportation by using UV lighting and air filtration. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more background here so you can have some idea of this technology. So UV light has been used for decades as a solution for cleaning water, air, and surfaces, particularly in hospitals and other medical settings. The light, when administered at the appropriate dose for the appropriate length of time, essentially damages the DNA of bacteria and viruses, making them unable to reproduce or replicate. So here on the slide, you can see a robotic UV light system for use in hospitals. This particular robot was designed in response to the COVID pandemic. So Luminaire's innovation is bringing this technology to from buildings to mass transit vehicles with a special focus on school buses, though metro buses and rail have other areas of focus as well. So in these cases, Luminaire has developed a filtration system that can be retrofitted to a bus's existing HVAC units, adding extra filtration through MERV 13 filters, which is a really high quality filter, and then using UV light to inactivate any contaminants that have been filtered out. Through interviews with the company founder and an analysis of some of the written artifacts, we examined their approach to communicating about their products, especially this innovative ultraviolet germicidal irradiation or UVGI product for mass transit vehicles. This is what we are focused on for this study.
So now we'll talk briefly about our methodology and methods. Given our interest in engineering writing pedagogy and entrepreneurial communication, we started our work with 3 research questions. What does entrepreneurial communication look like beyond the pitch? What rhetorical theories and strategies come into play in entrepreneurial communication? How can these findings be applied to the teaching of writing for engineering students? The dual methodology we used for this project was creating a case study via theoretical sampling and analyzing the data we gathered using grounding theory. After obtaining IRB approval, we gathered our data primarily in 2 ways. First, we collected artifacts from Luminaire's website. Second, we conducted 3 interviews with the president of Luminaire, Dan, that focused on the process of creating, marketing, and selling their products. In analyzing our data, we used the constructivist position of grounded theory, since its flexibility allowed us to have 2 core coding groups, which were direct communication and indirect communication. You can see some of the examples of our coding in handout 1. And we focus coded based on the 4 groups: adaptability and flexibility for the audience chain of command, audience accessibility, imagery and metaphor, and indirect communication. So adaptability and flexibility for audience chain of command focuses on being able to adapt your product and your communication to your audience's needs. This category also acknowledges that public bid audiences are comprised of multiple people with varying values or concerns who contribute to the end decision. Audience accessibility speaks to the type of language an entrepreneur uses, specifically that their language is not overly technical or jargon heavy and can be understood by the average person. The category imagery and metaphor concentrates on how figurative language can be used to help the average person visualize what an entrepreneur's product can do for them. And the indirect communication category fleshes out how a positive online presence is essential to the customer experience and gaining future customers.
Okay, so now we'll talk about some of the key findings that emerged from our research. As you can imagine, there's a lot to talk about. So we've just identified 2 themes that we'll talk about today. First, entrepreneurial sales communication as a process, and then second, distribution of agency across audiences. So during our interviews, one of the key insights that emerged is that entrepreneurial sales communication is an extended multi-genre process. In examining Luminaire's evolution from the creation of their novel UVGI product to their current work of selling and installing the UV and air filtration system in mass transit vehicles, It becomes clear that entrepreneurial sales communication involves a rich ecosystem of text, oral, written, and visual shared over an extended period of time. So in this first visual, we break down the entrepreneurial process in the mechanical engineering field into 5 phases: creating a product, creating awareness, bidding, installing, and following up. In this field, the communication genre we know as the pitch typically occurs in the first 2 stages of product creation or creating awareness when entrepreneurs are seeking to fund the development or scalability of a product. Looking at our data, though, we see that the communication process occurs over a much more extended period of time for multiple audiences and in multiple genres and mediums. We're currently describing the 2 main categories involved in this process as direct or active, and then indirect or passive communication. As you could probably infer, direct or active communication involves actively sharing information about products and services, including trade show events, webinars, phone calls, emails, and proposals. Indirect or passive communication involves activities like posting to social media, developing websites and informational videos, press releases, and doing media interviews. Although in some senses, this finding feels a bit like common sense, right? Like obviously it's a process, it's not just one and only type of communication that they do. It was striking to us to see the depth and the breadth of communication that goes on surrounding the entrepreneurial sales communication process, especially in stark contrast to that one and done image of the historic take style presentation that is fairly ubiquitous in engineering pedagogy. Another interesting finding related to the communication process surrounds the work of persuasion. In the case of typical sales presentations, we have students focus on arguing for a solution based on a recognized problem or need. In the case of Luminaire's work with UVGI, we observed that a major component of entrepreneurial communication is selling the problem. That is, helping potential customers see that there is a need or problem that should be addressed. In the case of air quality, Dan talked extensively in our interviews about differences in air quality standards for buildings versus transportation. In the world of buildings, there are multiple federal and state regulations providing guidelines on acceptable levels of contaminants, probably temperature too. It's very hot in this building. And ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, and NAFTA, the National Air Filtration Association, provide additional standards and best practices. Air quality in vehicles, however, is very little discussed or paid attention to at all, really. So given this deep lack of attention to air quality in transit, one of Dan's main communication activities has been educating potential customers about air quality in general, then finding ways to demonstrate how concerns about air quality are equally relevant in transportation. Much of the rhetorical work done here is creating an audience that would be receptive to persuasion. In analyzing Dan's rhetorical approach to this work, especially the education, we observed a frequent use of imagery and metaphor as strategies to educate and create actionable evidence. For example, one common image used in our data or type of imagery used is comparison of students in various spaces with a particular focus on using numbers. So let's see 3 examples here from the interviews and also the website. The first one is, if you look at the people density that is in a school bus, let's say you had a school bus that was just 2/3 of the way full, compare that to the typical classroom. A typical classroom might hold 25 people. The density of a school bus is like putting 275 kids in that 25-person classroom. Second, if a note came home from my student and said, due to construction, we're going to have 11 classes all in one classroom for an hour, people will be like, wait a minute, you can't do that. But that's what's going on in the bus. And then this is right from the classroom or from the website, the last example here. MERV 13 filters are recommended for schools. However, bus filtration is typically MERV 4. Students in school buses are spaced closely together as much as 10 times that of classrooms. Page. Okay, and so that's the kind of the first category, just looking at the process. The second category is distribution of agency across multiple audiences, and then that adaptability to those multiple audiences. So again, contrasting to what we see in Shark Tank style presentations of an audience of investors or business representatives who have the power to say yes or no right there, we see that the decision-making process in real world entrepreneurial sales is much more drawn out and distributed. We observed that for the first few stages of the sales communication process and the activities involved in these stages, there is little interaction with the ultimate decision makers. Before this, the sales communication process involves communicating with multiple audiences along a chain of command within a prospective customer's organization. As a result, we saw that communication, both direct and indirect, tended to accommodate both generalized and more technical audiences simultaneously. For example, documents such as the website, which are often a potential customer's first interaction with Luminaire, provide information regarding UBGI in a very accessible format. Into the top illustration there, just kind of the icons and short, very small snippets of information. There are also a lot of visuals and video explanations. However, when further exploring the website, we also see a more in-depth technical information, such as a clean air delivery rate calculator that would be used by technical specialists in the organization. And another example is this graph here with the text. So the data from our interviews echoed this layered approach to communicating with potential customers, demonstrating that effective communication in the entrepreneurial sales process required the ability to continually anticipate and identify audiences' diverse levels of understanding. In direct communication, such as webinars and trade show presentations, we saw that flexibility and adaptability were especially important, with Dan continually needing to flow back and forth between levels of technical detail and explaining concepts. And our final finding here, we noted the importance of social context in Dan's communication. At one point in our interviews, Dan noted that there's a degree of condescension among professionals in different areas of the transportation industry. In particular, he showed that workers in the rail segment tend to look down on the bus segment, even though they work for the same transit authority. He also noted that workers in the Metrobus scene tend to look down on the school bus industry. So it's clear that this attention and awareness of these social factors played an important role in the way that he chose to communicate. For example, in talking about persuasion, he showed awareness that disclosing the lower status part of the industry was doing wouldn't be unconvincing to members of an industry that saw themselves as higher status. A quote here from the interview: if we brought to them, hey, we're doing this stuff in the school bus, potential people might be like, well, so what? So we can definitely see his attention to that there.
So obviously we have covered a lot here, so we wanted to distill these findings into some takeaways that might be useful as we think about writing in classes related to entrepreneurship. First, while the pitch is obviously an important aspect of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial classes need to focus on more modes of communication if their students are going to be successful in their future endeavors. Specifically, we need to convey to students that the entrepreneurial communication process is extensive. As students should be aware that the smaller forms of communication like email, phone or Zoom calls, and presentation materials like PowerPoints are as important to their success as the initial pitch. Their ability to contact and follow up appropriately through these genres is just, if not more important, to landing a sale. Students within these courses should also be exposed to those different audience types and purposes. It is pivotal that they take into consideration that not every person who is interested in their future products wants to spend a lot of time learning about it and has different priorities that they are looking to fulfill through their project. For example, the person that is in charge of a company's diversity, equity, and inclusion sector is looking to know what Luminaire's DEI plan is. Instructors should frame these ideas through the audience chain of command. Oftentimes, the first person to make contact on behalf of their chain of command will relay that information to others. Students need to be able to simplify and adapt their communication so that it can be understood by various types of people with varying concerns about the product and the company down the chain of command. Instructors should also speak to the importance of multimodal digital marketing. The internet is typically the first point of reference for a product or company, so having a professional, tangible online presence is a must for burgeoning entrepreneurs. Multimodal forms of communication provide visual cues of how technical aspects of a product actually works, which can help overcome levels of understanding and audience types and just save any audience member research and processing time. In regards to language, instructors should dedicate time to discussing the power of concrete imagery, metaphor, and that figurative language, as this type of language tends to be the most memorable and illustrative of how the product will be helpful or provide a solution to the customer. This type of language is also useful for not alienating that average audience member and sustaining interest that could falter from a lack of understanding. So students should be thinking in line with, how will I get someone to remember and envision my product's goal? So in taking all this into account, we created an assignment sheet for an email response unit, which you can see on handout number 2. Here is a portion of handout number 2. So this unit would take place over the course of 2 weeks. So that would be 4 class periods total. The goal of this assignment is for students to begin anticipating those audience responses, utilizing the figurative language, understanding the diversity of audience types within the audience chain of command. This is why we have the varying audiences, and understanding the importance of the smaller genres of entrepreneurial communication. The students would be divided into groups of around 4 and would take the role of either a customer or a member of the Luminaire team. So students would swap roles at the end of week 1. So each student gets an opportunity to role play both as customer and member of team. The 4 audience types, as you can see, are in the dark, beginner, and intermediate and advanced. And then we also have audience purposes. So the 4 audience purposes or approaches to contacting the Luminaire team are: I just want a little information. I need to relay this information to my supervisor. What could this do for me? And I'm interested, but I want to know more about the company. The instructor should share everyone's responses and comment on strengths and improvements as a class lecture at the end of the unit. This resource could also be altered to situate any existing business within its current framework.
That's it. Thank you for listening. Welcome, people.
Well, yeah, we don't have a third person, so we can do the questions.
I have questions. You want the microphone?
Yes.
This microphone has made me chuckle all week long. So, okay, I have questions for Megan and for Grace Marie and Emily. So Megan, first of all, excellent presentation. This was perhaps the clearest definition of in vivo and descriptive research I've ever heard or read, for that matter. So kudos for that. I'm just curious, were there any responses that you found unusual, that were off the beaten path, not what you were expecting, out of left field, wacky, et cetera? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was the outlier in the discipline or outside of the discipline? Okay, interesting. Thank you. And then my second question for Grace Marie and Emily is just, I mean, really interesting. It's one of those presentations where I'm thinking to myself, why aren't more people studying the rhetorical dimensions of sales and entrepreneurship? That's really kind of a no-brainer for me, but I hadn't thought about it until now. So my question is, are people, I mean, is there a robust literature in existence on this that you were able to tap into for your research?
That's such a good question. So yes and no. Most of what we found is the pitch, which was kind of our beyond the pitch hook for our title. But yeah, a lot of people tend to study, like the presentation, like the sales presentation as this, just like cornerstone or keystone genre of, oh, there we go. Should check this way, should I check this way? Of the communication. So that's like probably the biggest area. There are some references on the assignment sheet. It's not a complete list, but yeah. So within especially like rec comp, tech comp kind of areas, that's pretty much where people have focus. I was kind of surprised as I was looking through. I'm like, there should be more on this, right? There is some, and I transparency, haven't gotten to fully dive in yet. We're hoping to continue working on this project and write an article. So we'll definitely continue our search. But like strategic communication seems to maybe touch a little bit in here, you know, obviously business communication, but it just wasn't as robust as I was expecting from what I found. So yeah, so I was like, there's more to talk about here. So let's do that. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add or.
I think I do have one thing to add. And yeah, what I thought was so interesting, like kind of a path that we went down for a little bit was like looking at like demographic information, and there is even less on that. Like I basically found like one or two sources on that, just like how that would, you know, interact with this project.
Oh, you know, they're not, but if I could figure out how to do that, I would do that. If we could definitely put our QR code back up if you want to grab that. Or I could figure out how to do that. We're a little bit behind the ball on getting things uploaded in a timely manner, but we got them up there. It was a week. It was a week. Let me know if that doesn't work for you. I can also happy to email or share documents. Yeah. Yeah. The one citation that's not in there is Spinuzzi. He had some, I just forgot to add it, I guess. But in the assignment sheet right at the beginning, there's a little opening paragraph with some citations in there. So that would be definitely a place to start. And yeah, we're definitely looking forward to seeing what else we can find. And yeah, just kind of connecting the dots. It's kind of one of those topics, which so much in like rhetoric, like there's so many different parts of the field that could have things to say about this, and tangential fields, like just pure up like entrepreneurial like journals, you know, like pure journals from the business field as well would have things to say about this, and engineering communication. So there's a lot of potential places, but the pitch seems to be the the highlight for sure.
And if you have any feedback for the assignment sheet, definitely send it our way.
Well, I do think and I'm not an expert on strategic communication or any of this, but I think there's a dearth. I mean, just my sense is that there's not a lot out there on this. And as you say, not connecting a lot of these dots from different areas of the discipline. So I would encourage you to maybe talk to some of the editors we have down here. Yeah, and pitch your idea. Yeah.
What you were talking about resonated with me because in my writing classes, I highly encourage them to approach their topics through creative writing. And if not that, then like multimodal things. And if you do a straight essay, of course, if you do it well, you'll get an A, but it's harder to do it through creative means. So they get rewarded, and I tell them they're going to get rewarded if they do it creatively well.
I have a question.
You're online. I know you stated your sample is obviously heavily like English humanities kind of people. We're out of the more STEM type fields or even more like social sciences. I guess I was just kind of curious how those folks think about, risk taking, and if they would be like, absolutely, like, is there a strong, like, no, we don't take risks in our field, or if you saw any, anything along those lines.
Yeah, I think I mostly got scientists who, instead of just going with the typical IMRAD format of which is very strict scientific article structure, they saw risk taking as working in something more untraditional, like narrative, or like using the first person, which for us is like, we do that all the time, but for them that is considered to be kind of risky, just in terms of publication. Like, is someone going to take me seriously? And then a couple people also talked about not just going the scientific paper route, but also publishing for the public. So going with something a little bit less formal, like a blog or like a, something more outside the realm of what they're supposed to do for tenure. A couple of them saw that as a risk. Yeah. So those were some patterns I noticed with that. Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, writing is about taking risks. Every time you sit there and write.
So I find, I don't know, I mean, I think it's interesting that people would have and it was one person, it sounds like, right? But it's interesting people would have like a negative reaction to that.
Yeah.
I also teach, so I teach English as well and writing. I have a question about the risk taking. So did you make any connections to where this idea comes from, like maybe in composition theory, or like why we need to assess students' willingness or ability to take risks so that it should be in a learning outcome, or like where does this idea come from? I'm wondering if you have any insights into that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have any answers about that. The only thing I would say is I'm probably someone who's more in the realm of, yes, every time we write something, it can feel risky, especially for student writers who are new at it. As a teacher, I've become more and more married to the rubric just because I want all of my assignments to be incredibly transparent. And I think a lot of that came out of my work with WEC, is just thinking a lot about how do I communicate those abilities and criteria to my students really clearly. And so because I had heard people talk a lot about how they really, really like it when students take risks with their writing, I'm like, okay, well, if you secretly kind of expect that when you're grading papers, it would be nice if maybe your students knew that that was going through your mind. But yeah, I don't necessarily know where it came from. I just know that I've heard people say it over and over again. And I discovered it even in my own materials. So I was like, what's that? Yeah. Yeah.
I know I'm the same. I feel the same about rubrics. I'm like, I just want everybody to know
Yeah.
everything. I'm just gonna put it out there. But that's so it's not something I would assess on, but like secretly
Yeah.
in my heart, I like get excited, when you get
Right.
that paper or project that's like pushes the boundaries. Yes, this is what I wanted.
Yeah.
So it's like extra credit, but not,
Yeah.
how do I keep it for not
Right.
being risky? But it's like secretly that is what I want. So
Mhm.
that'd be great to know why I want it.
Yeah.
Like, why do I
Yeah.
want
Right.
that? And-
Yeah. Why do I like that?
and how can I convey to students like this is what
Mhm.
like great writing looks like,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. So doesn't really answer your question. But.
interesting.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Girls who the students come to me from high school, not used to being encouraged to use their own voice.
Yeah.
And be their own selves.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so I have to pull that out of.
Yeah.
So much like,
Yeah. Yeah. Like, please do. I was just thinking that question. Yeah.
One writing
Yeah.
Mm. I hate that.
breaks my heart.
I just want to give a shout out to Emily for her first conference presentation.
Oh, yay.
She did all her
Very
parts.
excited.
Great job. I love this assignment sheet, by the way. I'm totally going to adapt this to my science writing class. So thank you for this.
I'm like, I have no. Great.
At night, once I was like, okay, I know my name. I know what school I come from. I got this.
You do.
It'll be fine.
It is more nerve wracking in front of peers for sure.
I feel like this year was.
That's true. That's your favorite.
Okay, well. Yay.
Our slides for social media purposes.
If you want one, so I'd be happy to. If on your own slides.
wanna
Oh,
pull-
good.
Do you want to go back full screen? or-
Oh, either way, yeah. I'll slap her on the. This is probably the first responsibility that. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, it is. Oh, I was like.
You're good, so.